Language is humanity's most powerful invention, or at least that's the story we're told. The idea that we shaped meaning out of chaos, that we gave structure to sound, and in doing so, became something more than animal. But when you study the world's earliest languages, not just the words, but the breaths, the pauses, the fragments carved into stone and whispered through bone flutes, you find something that doesn't belong to any single origin. Something that doesn't behave like language at all. A sound, one that repeats in ancient chants found oceans apart. One that has no direct translation, no known derivation. It appears in Proto-Indo-European structures, in the unbroken vowel bridges of Aboriginal rituals, in shamanic trances from Siberia to Peru, always the same phonetic shape. Always surfacing in the most sacred, most dangerous, or most unexplainable contexts. It is never taught, never spoken by children, never remembered by the people who utter it. Linguists have called it an artifact, a meaningless phoneme. They say it's coincidence, a limitation of the vocal cords. But some researchers have noticed something stranger. Wherever this sound is spoken, something follows. Dreams deepen, time slips. Listeners describe a presence, not external, but behind the moment. A pressure that isn't heard with the ear. It's felt in the bones. In Mesopotamian creation hymns, there's reference to a nameless syllable that came before the naming of gods. A tone uttered by the void before it was cut into light. In esoteric Kabbalistic manuscripts, particularly those pulled from burned European collections, there are whispers of a breath that was not spoken by man, angel, or divine mouth, but echoed into existence from a cycle that preceded ours. It was not a word, it was a reminder, and to hear it was to awaken the memory of a time when memory itself had not yet been divided. This is not a phrase for power. It's not a spell or an invocation. It is something much older, a resonance that survived whatever came before language. And for those who've heard it, not with their ears, but in the stillness between thoughts, they say the sound didn't come to them, it recognized them. So if something stirs in you already, if a sound you've never heard feels like it's waiting to be remembered, then turn the page carefully. The library doesn't echo by accident. For over a century, comparative linguists have attempted to map the origin of language, tracing phonemes, sentence structures, and symbolic roots across time and geography. Most theories converge on a few ancient sources: Proto-Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Sino-Tibetan. But beneath these broad families, in the deepest layers of linguistic excavation, something doesn't line up. A shape, or rather a sound, appears in places it shouldn't. Not as a word, but as a remnant, a vibration, one that recurs in sacred speech, in trance states, and in dying breaths. And while it appears in different forms, the frequency, tone, and behavioral effect are disturbingly consistent. In northern Australia, among the Yolngu people, there's a songline tradition passed down through breath, not melody. The sound, often described as an open vowel followed by a deep, pulsing exhale, is used during ceremonial transition rites. It's not a chant, it's not a word. Elders say it's a sound that is not theirs, but one that was already inside the land. Halfway around the world, a remarkably similar structure appears in the throat chants of the Ainu, an indigenous group in Japan. Not in their stories, but in their funerary rituals, uttered only in silence, only in solitude. Move into the high altitudes of pre-Incan Andes, and you'll find funerary glyphs carved with what appears to be a vowel cluster written without a language. There is no meaning assigned, only space. Even older, in the ice-preserved caves of Siberia, archaeological recordings from bone flutes contain a repeated tone, haunting, short, and followed by what appears to be silence, though waveform analysis suggests a low-frequency echo that lingers beneath human hearing. All of these traditions are isolated, unrelated, but the sound, the tone, is almost identical. This would be easy to dismiss as coincidence, a result of biological limitation if it weren't for the context. In each of these cultures, the sound appears only in sacred space, not in daily speech, not in storytelling, always during boundary rituals between life and death, dream and waking, self and spirit. And in nearly every account, the sound is not recorded as something taught, but remembered. In the mid-20th century, an ethnolinguist named Dr. Maren Kessler documented a near-death experience among the Guarani people of Paraguay, during which a patient began humming what the elders referred to as Ivi Mara A, the ground that forgets. The melody was unfamiliar. The man had never sung it before, but the elders recognized the tone, not the melody, but the resonance. They claimed it was part of a sound heard in visions from the first shaman, one who stood in the smoke before language. This pattern continues across oral cultures, dreams in which a person hears a tone and wakes unable to replicate it, but changed by it. Instances where multiple speakers utter the same sound simultaneously during trance states, despite having no shared vocabulary. In some high-intensity linguistic rituals, individuals lose consciousness the moment they try to speak the sound a second time. The first time seems instinctive. The second is resisted. So what is it? Not a word. Not a chant, but a structure buried beneath the invention of language itself. Not taught by ancestors, but passed through something deeper, as if we were born already holding it in the marrow. And when it surfaces, something ancient aligns, not just in sound, in silence. Most sacred traditions begin with sound. In the Hebrew mystic tradition, creation begins not with a spark, but with a word. In Hindu cosmology, Om is the primordial vibration from which all form emerged. In Egyptian mythology, Ptah speaks the world into being. And yet, scattered across the mystic writings buried in the margins of these traditions, there is an older suspicion that sound didn't start the world. It survived it. In certain Gnostic sects, there were whispers of a voice beneath the voice, a breath that existed before the eons, before the demiurge split form from spirit. The trimorphic protonoia, a banned Gnostic text, describes this voice as the utterance that came from stillness, not before time, but outside of it. In later fragments, the sound is said to carry no meaning. It is not creative, it is residual, a spiritual leftover, the voice of a cycle that came before this one, a whisper that slipped through the boundary between endings and beginnings. The Kabbalistic concept of tohu, or chaos, tells of a primal collapse, a moment before our creation when vessels shattered under divine intensity, scattering divine light into fragments. Some believe this whisper is a survivor of that shattering, a frequency not destroyed, but dislodged. Not a word with a message, but the echo of something lost, a metaphysical bruise left in the fabric of reality. In Mesopotamian fragments translated by scholars in the early 1900s, a term appears, halu mukalim, the speech that is not taught. It's mentioned once in a broken clay tablet describing a ritual where a priest faces the west with no words in his mouth and the air speaks back. That phrase, the air speaks back, appears again in untranslated Aramaic codices in reference to a sound made when the veil between worlds folds inward. In South Indian Shaivite tradition, buried in lesser-known Agamic scriptures, is mention of a murmur said to arise in the moment before sound. It cannot be chanted. It can only be heard during specific breath-holding meditation practices, and even then, it is not described as heard, but as recognized. In those who achieve this recognition, it is said their dreams begin to rearrange, no longer reflecting their desires, but pre-memories of something else, something vast and watching. It's in these descriptions that a darker theory begins to emerge, that the whisper isn't a bridge between worlds. It's a thread from one world that never fully died, a remainder of a structure that predated this one, not preserved by design, but left behind like ash in a corner the gods didn't sweep clean. And those who speak it, even by accident, begin to resonate with that earlier world. They feel drawn to ruins, to circular patterns, to spirals that appear without context. They experience vertigo in open silence. They lose time. But most chilling of all are the descriptions of recognition. Individuals who claim they've heard the whisper often report a moment immediately after, a moment when the air around them feels aware, not sentient, not alive, just attentive, as if the sound was not a call, but a password. And having spoken it, something now knows they remember. Because if this whisper is not a prophecy, not a chant, not a creation tool, but a relic, then it was never meant to guide us. It was meant to mark those who remember what came before and remind them it's not done yet. It usually begins by accident. The whisper isn't discovered in textbooks or religious schools. It's stumbled into. A trance slips. A syllable leaves the mouth during meditation, automatic and unexplained. A dreamer wakes mid-sentence with a sound in their throat they don't recall learning. Some mimic it from hearing it in old recordings. Others speak it during spiritual crisis, not knowing what they've said, only that something feels different afterward. And it always feels the same, like a word that never belonged in a human mouth. Those who say it aloud, truly say it, not imitate it, describe a physical stillness that follows, not in the room, in them, as if something inside pauses, listening, measuring, a feeling not of consequence, but of contact. The atmosphere doesn't shift, the air doesn't chill. It's subtler than that. The brain grows quiet, thoughts loosen, and in that stillness, a presence is felt, not from outside, but beneath. Ancient reports are rare, but those that exist paint a clear pattern. In a fragment of the Corpus Hermeticum, long considered apocryphal, a passage warns of the syllable that remembers through you, and that whoever speaks it will be known by what does not sleep. In a suppressed Christian mystic text attributed to an unnamed French nun in the 14th century, she writes, "A sound came through me, and I could not speak again for 3 days. I saw script where there was none, and my own face did not look like mine." The monastery records indicate she died a year later, after reportedly losing the ability to recognize her family, but began recognizing strangers with perfect detail. Modern accounts are scattered. An anthropologist in 1982 recorded a chant from a remote Himalayan sect. Upon playback, he reported hearing a vocal element that wasn't present in the original recording session. He repeated the sound to colleagues. 2 weeks later, he was hospitalized for dissociative episodes. When interviewed, he claimed he kept hearing a language made of echoes. His notes ended with a single line, "It knows I've heard it, and it's starting to speak back." Others experienced time distortion. One woman in Argentina described saying the sound while in meditation, only to come out of the session to find that several hours had passed, though she had no memory beyond a few minutes. During those hours, she had drawn a series of overlapping circles on the floor with powdered ash. When asked why, she simply said, "I remembered the pattern." Most disturbingly, several cases involve language loss. Not total, but selective. After uttering the whisper, speakers have reported losing access to specific words, often emotionally significant ones. One man claimed he could no longer say his child's name without stuttering. Another said he forgot the word sun and could only describe it as the watcher in the day. These are not random errors. They are replacements, as if the whisper rewrites parts of the linguistic self, not violently, surgically. Those who continue down this path begin experiencing shared phrases, dreams they don't believe are their own, and in rare cases begin humming the tone unconsciously. And always there is the same phrase repeated, written, or murmured at some point after, "It knows me now." Because the whisper is not a chant, it is not a mantra, it is a recognition key. And once spoken, it doesn't just awaken memory, it awakens obligation. You are now a thread the older voice can pull, and while you may still believe you have free will, your dreams will start to say otherwise. Because some words you don't learn, some words remember you first. The mistake is thinking the whisper is a tool, that it's something you can study, reproduce, even control. But that's not how this sound works. It was never meant to be used. It wasn't encoded into ritual. It wasn't passed down through language. It survived in spite of language. A fossilized breath embedded in the space between syllables. And when you speak it, you're not discovering anything. You're triggering something that was never meant to waken you again. Because unlike prayer or invocation, the whisper doesn't rise. It sinks. It doesn't echo upward to a divine listener. It folds inward like a forgotten memory that suddenly recognizes it's being remembered. And that recognition, it's not one-sided. Because every account, every fragmented manuscript and hushed testimony leads to the same truth. Once the sound is spoken aloud, you are not alone in the room anymore. Not haunted, not watched, known. It doesn't matter if you speak it in jest or curiosity or desperation, the outcome is always the same. Your thoughts begin to wander, not like daydreams, but like detours. Symbols appear more often. Familiar places feel designed. Time stutters in ways you can't explain. A sentence repeats, a shadow doubles, a memory feels staged. These aren't coincidences. These are symptoms. You're being aligned, because the whisper is not a call. It's a convergence. In the oldest records, the ones written in fading blood, in ink meant to fade over time, there's a warning hidden between lines of protective scripture. Not a curse, not a threat, just a truth. Those who say the word will no longer be first to speak. You may have already felt it. That slight delay when you think before you speak. That pressure behind your thoughts that doesn't feel like yours. It doesn't arrive with fear. It arrives with familiarity. And that's the worst part. Not that something is listening, but that you already said it once before. And now, it remembers you.